The harbor has a memory longer than any chart. That's what Calvin Sousa's grandfather used to say, cleaning a set of injectors at the workbench in the long Maine evenings, his hands moving from habit while his mind was somewhere else. He said the harbor remembered every boat that had ever worked it, every dredge that had ever touched its bottom, every structure that had changed the way the tide moved through its mouth. He said if you paid attention long enough, not weeks, not years, but decades, the harbor would tell you things no instrument had been designed to measure. Calvin was 69 years old. He had been paying attention for 31 years. He ran the only marine diesel repair operation in the harbor, a business that had existed in this building or near it since his grandfather arrived from the Azores in 1931, with a set of tools and a working knowledge of engines that nobody else on this part of the Maine coast could match. His grandfather had kept records, not repairs, but of the harbor itself, the state of the water, the behavior of the tide, the depth of the channel, the condition of the mooring ground, a form of institutional memory that his grandfather had simply called paying attention, because he had no better name for it. His grandfather's logbooks were in a battered trunk in the back of the workshop, 12 volumes, beginning in 1935, written in a handwriting that moved between Portuguese and English depending on what his grandfather was trying to say and which language came to him first. The Portuguese entries had a different texture to them, not denser necessarily, but more specific in some way that Calvin couldn't fully access without translation. He had read them many times. He could not read the Portuguese entries directly, but he had learned over the years which ones were worth getting translated, and he had gotten most of them done, one by one, whenever he found someone who could handle the particular dialect his grandfather had grown up with in the Azores. The translations had taken 20 years to complete. He had no regrets about any of them. Calvin had started his own tide logs in 1993, when he first noticed that his grandfather's record showed tidal behavior in this harbor that the current charts did not reflect. Not wrong, exactly, just incomplete. He had been adding to those logs ever since. The harbor had a particular quality in the early morning, before the overnight boats came back and before the summer traffic built up. In those hours it belonged to itself. The water moving in and out through the mouth with the measured authority of a system that had been doing this since long before anyone had thought to give it a name. Calvin noticed things in those early hours that he missed later in the day, when there was work and noise and distraction. The way the water surface behaved differently at the outer face of the old breakwater than it did at the inner end. The way the tide reached a certain dock post at a certain time, which he had been recording for years in his tide log. The old wooden breakwater had been there his whole life. It had been there his grandfather's whole life. It was not, by any modern standard, an impressive structure, a long row of timber cribs filled with stone, parallel to shore on the harbor's eastern face, designed in an era when harbor engineering was more instinct than calculation. It leaked, it settled, it let water through in ways a concrete structure would not. And in letting water through, it did something his grandfather had described carefully in the 1948 volume. It allowed the tide to find its way in and out of the inner harbor through two pathways at once, distributing the flow, moderating the current, keeping the mooring ground in the kind of gentle, predictable motion that held anchors reliably. His grandfather had not used engineering language. He had written, 2 ways for the water to breathe, important that it can. Calvin had read that entry many times. He had not needed to get it translated. The Portuguese in that sentence was simple enough that he had understood it years before he found anyone to confirm his reading. 2 ways, 2 pathways. The word for breathe was the same root as the word for life, or close enough that the distinction felt academic. His grandfather had chosen his words the way he always chose them, not because they were precise, but because they were true. The Meridian Coastal Group had purchased the old boat yard the previous autumn. It was a regional real estate investment trust, professionally managed, with a track record of coastal redevelopment projects up and down the New England coast. Their plan for this harbor was straightforward: a luxury marina with 50 slips for visiting yachts, a waterfront hotel occupying the redeveloped boatyard building, an event space positioned along the inner harbor face. The project had received its permits, negotiated its approvals, and begun preliminary engineering work by the time Calvin heard about it at the harbor master's winter meeting. The meeting was in the community room at the town library. About 30 people attended. The project was presented professionally: renderings, economic projections, timeline. The marina would accommodate vessels up to 60 feet. The hotel would bring year-round employment. The event space would extend the town season by 8 weeks on either end. Calvin sat in the third row and listened to all of it. The part that stayed with him was the breakwater replacement. The old timber structure would be removed and replaced with modern armored stone breakwater. Engineered to current standards, designed to last 100 years. The new breakwater would extend 12 feet further into the harbor mouth than the old one, creating additional protected water for the expanded marina. 12 feet. He turned that over in his mind on the drive back to the shop. He pulled out his grandfather's 1948 volume that evening and read the entry about the water breathing through 2 pathways. He sat with his own tide logs for a while, looking at the columns of measurements he had been recording for 31 years, thinking about what a 12-foot extension would do to the geometry through the harbor mouth. He did not know how to calculate this. He was a diesel mechanic, not a hydrologist. He knew tides the way a man knew them who had been watching one harbor for 31 years, not the way an engineer knew them with models and instruments. But something felt wrong. He wrote it in his log and left it there. The tidal range had been changing, and Meridian didn't know it yet. Not obviously. Not in the way a storm surge changes things, suddenly and visibly. This was slower. The kind of change that only appeared if you were comparing this week's high water mark against the same week's mark from 3 years ago, or 5, or 10. Calvin had been making that comparison since the preliminary dredging and site preparation work began the previous spring. He had almost decided it was his own perception. That was the problem with long observation. Sometimes you started seeing changes that weren't there, your mind supplying patterns to fill in what the data left uncertain. He had spent a month checking his own measurements against each other before he trusted what they showed. He had even borrowed a different measuring instrument from the chandlery to verify that his own wasn't reading incorrectly. It wasn't. The high water mark at Dock Post 7, which he had been recording since 1993, had been consistently higher over the past 9 months. The low water mark had been consistently lower. The range, the distance between high and low, had grown by a measurable margin, not a dramatic margin, but real. In a harbor, a larger tidal range meant more water moving in and out per cycle. More water moving in and out meant more current. More current meant more energy in the water, and more energy in the water meant different forces acting on everything the water touched: the bottom, the moorings, the dock structures, the banks. He watched the construction proceed through the summer. The old timber breakwater came down in sections, each section removed cleanly. The stone fill redistributed offshore where the new structure would be built. He recorded each phase in his tide log. He noted when the harbor mouth was temporarily open without any structure, and he noted the way the tidal behavior changed during those weeks, the current running faster through the unobstructed mouth, the mooring ground more active, the boats swinging more widely on their lines. He noted when sections of the new stone breakwater went in. He noted the date each section was completed and how the water behavior changed in response. He was building a record. He did not yet know exactly what it was a record of. The harbor's annual stakeholders meeting happened in late September, and Calvin had been preparing his presentation for 6 weeks. He brought his tide logs, not all 31 years, which would have been unwieldy, but a careful selection. His own records from the past 3 years showing the tidal range increase, and his grandfather's records from 1948 and 1963 showing what the harbor's tidal behavior had looked like before the current structure. About 20 people attended: marina operators, fishing permit holders, a few year-round residents who owned property near the harbor. Meridian's marine engineer, a professional man named Beaumont, was there to present the project's progress. He listened to Calvin's presentation with what appeared to be genuine attention. When Calvin finished, Beaumont said that minor tidal range variations were a normal characteristic of harbor systems, and that they fluctuated seasonally annually with weather patterns and with regional factors that had nothing to do with any single infrastructure project. He said the new breakwater had been modeled using 2 years of local tidal data, the standard baseline for this type of project, and that the model showed the structure's hydraulic effects were within acceptable parameters. Calvin asked how far the new breakwater extended into the harbor mouth compared to the old one. Beaumont said 12 feet further. Calvin said his grandfather's logs showed that the original timber breakwater had been built 12 feet shorter than an earlier stone structure that had been removed in the 1920s, and that his grandfather had written in 1936 that the harbor's mooring ground had been difficult to use for 2 seasons after that removal, until the timber structure was in place, and the water found its second pathway again. Beaumont said he was not familiar with that historical record and would look into it. He said the project's monitoring plan included quarterly assessments of harbor conditions. Calvin thanked him. He drove home. He put the presentation materials back in the filing cabinet where he kept his tide logs and sat in the shop for a while before starting any actual work. He thought about whether he had made his point clearly enough. He thought about whether it mattered if he had. The first full winter after the new breakwater's completion was normal by any meteorological standard. Not an exceptional storm season. Not unusual tidal extremes. The kind of Maine winter that happened every year. With the kinds of storms that the harbor had absorbed for generations without particular incident. The mooring field, however, did not respond the way it always had. 3 moorings dragged in December during a storm that generated nothing more than moderate harbor conditions. Seas that the old mooring field would have held against without difficulty. Calvin watched from the dock as 2 lobster boats swung wide and bumped against each other before the harbor master got a line on them. He wrote it in his tide log. Date, conditions, which moorings, how far they dragged. In January, 2 more dragged during a similar event. The second one belonged to a woman named Pixoto who had been fishing out of this harbor for 19 years and had never had a mooring problem in her life. She came in the next morning and stood looking at where her boat had ended up and said nothing for a long time before she asked the harbor master what had happened. In February, one of the longest-held moorings in the field, a heavy-working fishing vessel that had sat on its chain for 11 years without incident, dragged 40 feet before coming to rest against the inner harbor dock face. The harbor master filed incident reports. Meridian's project office received them. The consensus, at a brief meeting called in March, was that the mooring field might need reassessment, that the moorings themselves, some of which were aging, might need heavier anchoring components. Calvin attended that meeting and said the mooring dragging was not a mooring problem. He said it was a current problem. He said the current in the inner harbor had changed since the new breakwater extended the harbor mouth, and that the change was consistent with what his grandfather had documented happening in the 1920s, when an earlier structure had reduced the harbor's tidal exchange to a single pathway. Beaumont was also at the meeting. He said the project's monitoring data showed current velocities within normal parameters. Calvin said the monitoring stations were in the outer harbor near the new breakwater, where the velocity was being measured at the funnel point. He said the problem was in the inner harbor, where the current was behaving differently because it was no longer being distributed through 2 pathways. Beaumont said that was an interesting observation and asked if Calvin had data to support it. Calvin said he had 31 years of tidal records at Dock Post 7. It took 3 more months. 2 additional mooring failures, one of them significant enough to cause minor hull damage to a dock vessel, and a formal report to the state's Coastal Management Authority, before Meridian commissioned an independent hydrological assessment of the inner harbor. The assessment was conducted by a firm from Portland. They deployed current meters at 4 stations in the inner harbor, ran them for 12 weeks across all tidal conditions, and compared the results against regional baseline data. What they found aligned precisely with what Calvin's tide log showed. The new breakwater's extension had reduced the harbor mouth secondary tidal exchange pathway, the route that had historically allowed a portion of each tidal cycle's water to move through the harbor's eastern face rather than through the main channel. The timber structure had allowed this because it was permeable, because it let water through. The armored stone structure was impermeable. The water now had only one pathway, and the current through that pathway was running approximately 19% faster than the pre-construction baseline. A faster current in the inner harbor meant more scour. More scour meant less stable bottom. Less stable bottom meant moorings that had held for years would no longer hold in conditions they had always survived before. The assessment team asked for historical baseline data. Calvin gave them his 31 years of tide logs and, separately, his grandfather's relevant volumes from a trunk in the back of the shop. The senior hydrologist spent 2 days reading the grandfather's records. She asked Calvin about the 1920s entry, the one about the harbor being difficult to use after the earlier stone structure was removed, before the timber breakwater restored the second pathway. Calvin explained it as best he could, acknowledging the gaps in his own understanding of what exactly had happened in the 1920s and what his grandfather had meant by his notations. She said she understood. She said, the timber structure worked because it breathed. That was essentially correct hydrological behavior, even if his grandfather had used a different vocabulary for it. Calvin said his grandfather had always been better at knowing things and explaining them. She said she thought that was probably true of most people who paid the kind of attention his grandfather apparently had. Calvin thanked her for the time she'd spent with the logs. She said she was going to recommend that the historical records be formally archived with the state's coastal management database. Not because they were required, but because they were the kind of record that tended to be useful in ways that nobody could predict in advance. He said that sounded like something his grandfather would have approved of. The remediation involved designing and installing a series of controlled flow-through gaps in the new breakwater's lower section. Openings calibrated to restore approximately 60% of the secondary tidal exchange that the timber structure had previously allowed, without compromising the breakwater's structural integrity or its storm protection function for the marina. It was not inexpensive. It required engineering work that had not been in the original project budget. Meridian's legal team and their construction contractor spent several months working through the question of responsibility. The state coastal management authority's formal response declined to require complete reconstruction, but did require the flow-through modification before the final occupancy permit for the hotel would be issued. The modification was complete by the following autumn. The current meters stayed in place through the first post-modification winter, confirming that the secondary exchange pathway had been restored and that inner harbor current velocities had returned to something close to their pre-construction baseline. The mooring field held that winter. Every mooring held. The hydrologist's formal report cited Calvin's tide logs as the primary source of pre-construction baseline data. 31 years of continuous tidal range and timing records at fixed points, a data set that no official monitoring program had thought to collect because no official monitoring program had known there was anything to collect. It also cited in a footnote the relevant entries from his grandfather's logbooks, specifically the 1936 entry about the harbor's mooring ground behavior after the earlier stone structure's removal, and the 1948 entry about the importance of the harbor having two pathways. His grandfather had described the harbor's breathing in 1948. The word appeared in a hydrological assessment report in 2024. Calvin read the citation sitting at the workbench where his grandfather had cleaned injectors in the long Maine evenings. The trunk was open nearby, the 1948 volume sitting on top where he'd left it. He thought about his grandfather arriving in 1931 with tools and attention, and a habit of writing things down that he had carried from the Azores across an ocean to a harbor that had no particular reason to make room for him, and had, eventually, because he was good at what he did, and because the harbor kept revealing things to him that he was patient enough to see. He thought about the word breathe, written in 1948 in a harbor workshop that no longer existed, in a logbook that had spent decades in a battered trunk, read by a hydrologist who had understood immediately what it meant. Some knowledge traveled strangely before it arrived where it was needed. Calvin closed the report and put it in the filing cabinet beside the tide logs. He picked up the 1948 volume and carried it back to the trunk with the care he always used with it, the kind of care you gave to something irreplaceable. The harbor moved outside, the tide running through both pathways the way it had always run when it was allowed to. The mooring field was quiet. The boats rode easy. The water was doing what his grandfather had understood it needed to do. It had simply needed someone to remember.